as a potential. And that this is part of the core of the existentialist line of philosophy that kind of Smith builds upon, but that comes through Hannah Arendt and Philip Rieff, comes through Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Hegel, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Heraclitus, and was pretty widespread among the classical Greeks, to the point that many of the classical Greek philosophers who don't talk about it explicitly, once you know how the schema works, you realize they're talking about it implicitly, even when they don't say the words. Just like there's all kinds of things that we don't think to say because we take them for granted. They took it for granted. It was the way they conceived of the world. So they imagined that, human beings are born with three potential mental faculties, one of which we're born directly into, which is this begriff, or what we might call naive gnosis, where we are like live wire experiencing everything. Our feelings are huge to us. Our perceptions are huge to us. Everything is very immediate. And as a result, we are very plugged into the world. The relationship between us and the world forms a whole because we're dependent upon it. We suffer the world and what it's doing, and we respond immediately to it because we have no schemas, we have no theories, we have no models. We're too new. We don't even know what our hand is and why it hits us in the face. I mean, we are not abstracted at all from what's going on. We're not even abstracted enough from what's going on to understand what's going on. To understand it would be a step in the process of abstracting. So we're born directly into that one faculty, which Hegel calls begriff, and which the Greeks sometimes referred to as a naive form of gnosis. And then from there, we start struggling to develop into the second faculty, the potential for which we're born with right out of the gate. And that's the abstracting capability within us, the systematizing, linearizing capability, or as Hegel puts it, the negative, the negating capability that allows us to begin distancing ourselves from our own experience and from the experience of the world, so that we don't have to hit ourselves in the face with our hand. We can start to learn what our hand is and that it's ours, and that we could control its behavior. And that idea of separating ourselves from ourselves enough to make decisions about ourselves, and that is part of the path, not only of growing up, but of colonizing this second capacity that we're born with, which the Greeks called noesis, and which Hegel calls Verstand. That this is critical to understanding the human condition. That we are on this, from birth, we enter into this journey away from begriff and toward Verstand. And under different civilizations, people tend to resolve themselves into different places, along that journey, based on what feels comfortable to them, what feels right to them, what feels like them, what they invest themselves into. Because even though we have both faculties, our relationship, they're hostile to each other. This is part of where Hegel it gives us a lot to work with, and Kierkegaard it really develops it. That the capacity for noesis, Verstand, it holds begriff in contempt. Right? The reason, there's a lot of attractions in begriff. There's a lot of joy in life. There's a lot of being real and being whole and feeling complete that's in begriff. But Verstand sacrifices that for the power of abstraction, for the capacity to predict the future and to control ourselves and to control the world around us. All of the development of science and technology, all of the development of schemas of laws and civilizations, anything that's systematic is only made possible because of the distance we create between ourselves and our naive begriff that we're born into. So, but people come down in different places on this because they repel each other, because each one looks at the world and sees a different world. And it specifically sees a world in which everything in that world cannot possibly be what the other one sees. Because that's what the process of growing out of begriff consists of, is saying no and pushing away from that and looking at things in a new way. Because of that, the modernist idea that everybody falls somewhere on a spectrum or a balance in between, and that we're all pretty much the same, and it's one kind of thing, and we don't have to worry too much about it, is complete bull. It doesn't work at all to model what's going on here. What we have are two gravity wells. And if you get anywhere near one of the gravity wells, if that attracts you, you're going to want to be more that way, right? Because the things that attract you about it, once you start to see how the schema works, it has more to tell you about what's wrong with the other schema. And so we push ourselves apart into these camps. And the camps we push ourselves apart into are people for whom Verstand is the master and Begriff is the servant. We may allow ourselves to have feelings, but we control them, or we suppress them or repress them, or we make rules and laws about where we're allowed to engage in them, and then we police those boundaries to keep those feelings and emotional behavior within those limits. That would be a Verstand mastering, Begriff serving schema of the mind, of personality, of character. Or many people don't like the Verstand. The more they move that way, the less whole they feel, the less real and authentic they feel. They want to live for the moment and for the day. They want to feel authentic. They want to stay plugged into themselves in the world. They don't want to lose themselves the way you have to live the Verstand life. And so they only internalize enough Verstand to serve their Begriff desires, their Begriff experiences. For them, Verstand is the servant and Begriff is the master. That's the schema. So it's not that anybody is purely one or the other. I mean, we're literally born with both capacities. Unless somebody literally had part of their brain excised, it wouldn't be possible for them to be purely one or the other. And even then, brain plasticity suggests that the brain would adapt and again try to reassert both mental faculties, because we use them both. We need them both. They're both incredibly important and relevant to us. And each one gives us something without which we sort of can't survive or be a whole person. So, but the problem is that not only do each of these mentalities rule out the other one and sort of repel it and say, well, that's not us, that's them. They do that. Like when smart people laugh at the Darwin Awards about stupid people locking themselves into safes or shooting themselves or all the things that people say, haha, he's a Darwin Award winner. When they do that, that's an example of the process of saying, thank God I'm not that other character type, right? There is this mutual repellency. But it makes them, their preoccupation with each other makes them think that they're the only two options there are. And that's where we get into trouble. Because we are also born with the potential for a third mental faculty. And the third mental faculty is critically important. But in the modern world, we buy into a Verstand worldview that argues that the only two possibilities are Begriff and Verstand is the right way and Begriff is the wrong way, so everybody should be Verstand. We try to educate people in a Verstand system. We use Verstand systems of economics and laws and politics to organize ourselves. We massively cultivate within ourselves a commitment to schemas and systems. We teach math all 12 grades for a reason, right? You are going to learn to be linear. You're going to learn to abstract so that you can plug yourself into our abstract schemas and systems and how they work. And that only works if either you voluntarily do it because you want to, because you're of a Verstand personality type, character type, or because you're so easy to manipulate because you're of a Begriff character type. And so for a Begriff person, all the things they want and their feelings become the handles that the Verstand character type uses to manipulate them into place. The things that we see in political speeches, the emotionalisms, the things we see in advertising, the things we see in other forms of propaganda, all this stuff is designed to, say, you can either live the cold life of being, disciplined and rigorous and systematic and educated, or you can live the hot animal life of having all your feelings and experiences. But the price for doing that is that we will cultivate you and harness you and use you to drive our engines. right? Where you're going to be the source of fodder for our economy and for our politics. You'll be the people that we scare or attract in order to get you to vote one way or another, or to get you to buy one thing or another. So there is this, even if it were possible to straddle somehow these two mutually antagonistic gravity wells, there's actively work going on all the time to maximize the difference between them, to make the begriff type, character type, more manipulable, easier to harness as a natural resource, or perhaps I should say as an artificial resource, because that's the engine of the modern world. Whether it was slavery, whether it was genocide, whether it was plantation economics, whether it's the modern wage slave or debt slave, anybody who can be captured within that begriff schema of being driven by their desires and needs is somebody who's easy to manipulate. It's much harder to manipulate somebody who doesn't need anything from you or want anything from you, right? So we maximize things. We get people into debt. We make sure they have children early so that we can always keep them worrying about, how do I feed my children? How do I clothe my children? How do I house my children? How do I educate my children? It's a set of handles, right? That's designed to make them more manipulable. And that's part of the downside of the Verstand life. You get to be in charge, but the more Verstand you go, the more it comes at the price of all of the things worth living for. You get this thing. People talk a lot about, when they, after they've won the game and late in life, they're looking around going, I have this mansion, I have all these cars, I have all this stuff, but I didn't get to enjoy any of it because I just spent all my time, with spreadsheets and meetings and plotting my campaigns for how I could establish control. And, if I had not done that, then I would not have had control, right? Because I would have been wasting my time living my life instead of, succeeding by abstracting myself from my own life. So there is this. This is one of the things Marx talks about. For example, he's a Hegelian of a sort. One of the things he talks about is that, contrary to modern Marxist dogma, the struggle between capitalists, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, isn't about the fact that the bourgeoisie gets what they want and the proletariat doesn't. It's not about the fact that one side wins and the other side loses. He says everybody loses. Everybody lives half of a life because they are half of a character. They're so forced into one of these two faculties that we have natively as people that they end up living a kind of half-life in which half the things that you need to be a complete human being are excluded from their lives, or are only available in little dribbles, sort of rationed, shall we say. The hyper successful bourgeois person may occasionally go out for a nice dinner. Once every month or every week, maybe I get to see my children. I fly back home from the city I work in to the city where my family lives, and for a moment I get to be a person. But then, in order to sustain my control, I have to fly back out and resume what I was doing. And the same for the proletarian who is in debt, is always struggling, is always worrying. But every so often, like they get a tax break from the IRS and they get to buy themselves a TV that isn't so awful, or they go out for a nice dinner once a month or something. It's like, yay, I got to have a little bit more for a moment, and imagine what it would be like if I won the lottery and was able to liberate myself from my begriff life and live the Verstand life that I yearn for and I've been taught to crave. Now, none of this is talking about what the third type is. This is just talking about the trap of the two types. And the reason we talk about that is that this is the architecture of the modern epoch under Kenneth Smith's philosophical system. And he's not unique in this. I mean, Arendt and Hegel and the rest, they also have all the ingredients for talking about this. They're also, this is part of the existentialist thrust. So this sets us up for the discussion that last week I said we would have this week, which is, what is that third faculty that we're born with? If, as Hegel says, it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis, if he says that's a Kantian error, and what it really is bud, blossom, and fruit, because each one grows out of the other as a new stage that has to push off against the other to become the new thing that it becomes, but that also is somehow the fulfillment of the seeds within the previous schema. Then whatever this third thing is, that we're capable of doing must arise from the conflict between the Begriff part of our mind and the Verstand part of our mind. And likewise, the Begriff-centered character and the Verstand-centered character. So I'm going to pause for questions before we go on. And I see we've got hands. So how about Phil and then Ayala? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, as you were talking, I realized that on some level, I taught that in one of my art classes. I'm probably one of the few artists who taught the language of Cubism. Uh, and, and, and I realized that when you're talking that modernism and art, it's kind of different from modernism in culture and philosophy. Because the moment that Cubism came along, it was really an open language that could continue to grow. But as it progressed, what happened is it enclosed itself into itself. And even though I admire Mondrian immensely, he became the high priest, and then we got a system that was essentially just pure design.
Yes.
I was thinking of particularly one project I did, because what I did is I reversed the Renaissance system where you start with the object and you learn to illustrate and you put things together and so forth. I started with essentially abstraction, and once they learned the abstraction and the different ways you could maneuver that abstraction, then we went into representation. And one of the abstraction projects I did was like, I said, next time bring in uh, some stones of several size categories. A large one, and I didn't define how large is large, but a large one and a medium-sized one and a small one. Okay, they have to decide. And what we did was, when I said start, I want you to like first put the large one in whatever pattern you want on the paper, and then put the medium-sized one and wherever you want to in the paper, and then finally put the small ones. And after that, I have them tick each of the stones off and made a relative mark, just a dot on all those places. And they don't have to, be the shadow of the thing, just like, the big ones, middle size, and the little ones. I said, now draw a kind of dotted line around the structure in which you create the kind of skeletal bone, the backbone, and so forth, the major extensions, and then put in some little ones and so forth. Okay. And I say, this is the underlying diagram of the artwork. Okay.
Yes.
Now, what I said is like, because they've been doing this abstract art, like now connect these and shade these in certain ways. So in a sense, now you have a surface structure that obey to a certain degree the underlying skeleton. And then, with the way you manipulate space, in a certain way, like the cubist space of in and out and so forth. And then we will show it. And then what they did was they did this, and then there was essentially these analytic cubist paintings. I mean, cubist drawings. I said, now go and take a look at a classical work. I mean, classical, I mean like the Renaissance work.
Right.
And I want you to take a look at one of these works and now make the skeletal diagram of how you would analyze it, how you think it is, or how the movement it is, and draw a skeleton. Now I want you to take that to a new piece of paper and use that diagram, not to retrace the surface structure, create your own language out of this cubist manipulation of planar spaces, and then create something else. Now, somebody else could take a look at the same painting and they have a slightly different skeleton, and it would be a different painting. I said, this is a way you could then, in a sense, look at a master work and see its potential to be something else, rather than say, oh, it's the surface structure we're looking at. So in a sense, it's kind of like mixing the sort of like theoretical skeletal part, and also how have that being filled out by the surface expression of it. And so in a sense, it's kind of like what we do in life, in a sense that we live a life that in some sense is a surface structure, but we have to have some organization in a loose way that we could then organize that and then manifest in a certain way, but don't make it so rigid that in a sense it can transform itself, right? So that's why you could then take something that's on one level looks totally different, like that's a classical painting, and now you could change it to something else, simply because a diagram will give you enough structure that you could then unfold into a new language of describing things, how things are moving. So in a sense, I think in life you have to have a deep structure of what it is you want to be, and then unfold it from that structure out in a
Yes.
way that doesn't freeze it, that allows it to unfold. Now, as soon as you freeze it as like that's the ultimate diagram, then you have a problem.
Right.
So, it was really kind of, it was an interesting thing because I brought in the kind of like, because the first part of making the skeleton is intuition. You don't even know what you're doing. You just put
Right.
the rocks, like, okay, this looks kind of okay. I'm not quite sure what he's doing, but okay, that looks okay. And then you make the skeleton out of that, because now you can interpret it and make a skeleton, and then you can unfold it. So in a sense, you start with intuition, and then you unfold the intuition into an intellect, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it's exercises like that are so interesting because they force us to confront how different creativity is from inventiveness. When we stay within the schema of a system or something we've learned, we can be inventive. We can manipulate according to the rules of that schema, but we can't break out of the box, because we're stuck into their Verstand mindset. If when we engage in a more creative act where we don't know why we're doing the things we're doing, then new possibilities emerged that our conscious mind never could have planned for. And when you make the two interact with each other through exercises like that, it produces very interesting results, right? And it's often hard. You see sometimes when people are talking about coming up with strategies or ideas, they recommend that meetings be broken into a brainstorming part where you're not allowed to criticize ideas, followed by an analytical part where you are. Because if you try to do them at the same time, they shut each other down. They're so hostile to each other. Um, and that's reflecting that fact that we've got both of these capacities, but they don't play well together, shall we say, unless you carefully segregate them and arrange the activity in such a way that they each get their moment to shine, to do the thing that they do. So that's an interesting example, Phil. Thank you. Ayala, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, a few comments on that. As Rick spoke about Marx's universal tendency to get over the categories. Yeah, indeed, he was a universalist, and he didn't mean to just reverse the top dog, underdog over, having the same class system, except having the proletariat have the power and the money. Yes, but the absurd and the problem in that is, in order to get to that point of elimination, first it requires, according to Marx and other socialists, it requires solidifying class, not only through creating a higher, relying on higher solidarity, but also on class consciousness. It will not work without class consciousness. And the tricky part is once you develop this class consciousness and solidarity, how do you snap out of it to a paradigm, a mental paradigm of no class, no categories? So that's, and as we see in some examples of the Soviet Union, Latin American experiments in China, it really didn't work very well. The same thing is true about any identity politics that takes place now. We want to eliminate those false categories dividing people, such as race and gender. But to get there, first we solidify the identity, the importance and significance of identity. The final cause is to snap out of it. And that's why feminism should turn into humanism or planetarianism or something like that, for example. Now, as far as the faculties of the mind, those are very interesting perspectives of philosophers that lived before fMRI. And with fMRI, we found that the brain is not a single organ that has different faculties, but it's composed of multiple neurosystems, multiple brains.
Right.
Not only they are not always coordinated, but very often they are not even in knowledge of each other.
Right.
So, and yes, I like that you brought the faculty of distancing, the ability to distance, and that's it's not exactly, I mean, it's more than just abstraction. Abstraction can involve the inductive system as far as we look at data and we infer patterns from that or relationships. We don't know that the relationships really exist, but they are a product of our mental manipulation. But the distancing is perhaps the faculty that is the only one that gives us some will. I would hesitate to say free will, but we practice. This is where we really experience the freedom to change what is in us. So it's a narrow space that we have in the brain to exercise will, and that is inhibit. We are inclined to, the person who, an alcoholic, let's say, inclined right now to go to the bar and drink themselves to the night, and yet found in himself or herself the ability to inhibit that and instead stay at home or do something else or call their sponsor. It is a very difficult to do because the distance requires us to get over the emotional part of the brain, which is usually dominating, even if we don't agree with that, we don't realize that. And part of the emotional part is what we call the ego or the self-image. So to do things, to distance from a wishful thinking, from paradigms that we have invested all our lives with, say religion, and all of a sudden you realize that it doesn't make sense, but all your life you were in a community, you were in a family that finds its emotional support on that. And so to distance ourselves from that and announce defeat is rare. We don't, we are not inclined to do that. Those were just footnotes.
Thank you, Ayala. So our challenge, of course, is that if most of us, because of the structure of modernism, which is a whole other discussion, if most of us are stuck within one of these two mentalities, like if our character is cultivated and also self-cultivated to throw us into one of these two camps, the problem we have, it goes back to that very first item on the capsule treatment of Kenneth Smith's philosophy, which is the difference between the mind and reality. That when, you know, as Kafka says in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. You know, when the reality in us disagrees, we're the ones who's wrong. But the problem is that we have this astonishing capacity to rewrite what we see in the world to fit what's in our minds. We play foreground background games unconsciously, almost as easily as we see, so that the things before us that would disprove the way we see the world, we can reflexively suppress so that we don't see them. So now there's no disproof. And the things that we see in the world that seem to prove our worldview, we can draw into the foreground so that they seem to be the entirety of the evidence and that they prove that we're right. And since we're right, there's no need for us to question our worldview. This ability gives us something like what you know in the myth of Theseus is the Procrustean bed, in which the truth of the world, which is a guest in our minds, gets tortured on the bed of our minds until it fits the preconceptions and the shape of our worldview. And that presents an enormous problem. It means that the natural acting out processes of the mind are to self-delude. They are to try to resist change and to create cognitive illusions about the world so that the world looks like a very different place than it actually is. And if we were all doing this idiosyncratically, it would be bad enough. But the fact that the mentalities that we're talking about function the way they do means that although we each in theory all have our own separate worldview, in practice, each of our worldviews is some member of a common species of worldviews, either the Begriff species of worldviews or the Verstand species of worldviews. They cluster around and orbit their gravity wells. Because it's the mind itself that is doing the work. So if the mind is acting in certain stereotyped ways, it's going to interpret the data in certain stereotyped ways and thus produce certain stereotyped worldviews. And so there's whole suites of mostly mutually compatible Verstand worldviews that are wrong about the world in certain ways. And there's whole suites of somewhat mutually compatible Begriff worldviews that are wrong about the world in very different ways. And each of them looks at the other as obviously being wrong because they're the wrong species and they don't agree with how they see the world. But they also look at the world and say, yeah, the world is the way that I think that it is. And I can prove it. I can prove that I'm right so that I'm more confident and can stay and sort of build out this shell around myself. This, you know, Kenneth Smith uses the terms a claustral or cultural envelope that we project like a soap bubble with a mirror surface on the inside, so that what we see outside is a reflection of what we expected to see. And we're able to obscure the things that we don't expect and don't want to see, unless they're compatible with the worldview we have, in which case we use them to grow our bubble and make it stronger.
Could I show you an object? I mean, it's kind
Before
of...
you do, Sharon's got her hands up. So
Okay.
I'm going to call on her and then you.
Well, Sharon's kind of not quite sure where we are today. So I'm listening and I want somebody to help me. And this is what I got from everything we've said about Begriff and Verstand.
Yes.
And it's this paragraph on page 32 that it
Yes.
says, as moderns, we're talking about modernism, battered by centuries of accrued Platonic abstractionism and single-minded Christian orthodoxy, by centuries as well of culturally impoverished modern science, scientific economy, and academism, by one monopoly on the truth after another, none of these monocultures compatible with others, we are perfectly illiterate in the art of self-interpretation, the techniques for reading and superseding our own prejudices. That's what we're saying, right?
That's what we're saying.
But that was for thousands of years what culture, philosophy, and religion were indeed good for.
Yes.
Making us competent to understand our own subtleties, to use nimbly the dowsing wand, that's the bubble, of our tending human nature, that we might understand essence as the unique kind of subjective objective principle that it is.
Yes.
So is that what we've been saying this whole time?
Yes.
Because I'm kind of lost.
That's what we're talking about. You're right on it.
Okay.
You're right on it. And the reason that we're talking, so far I haven't got to the third mentality, the third character type, and the third structure. And the reason that we're setting up the two is because we're trapped in the two. So for us, even imagining the third is nearly impossible. We have to understand the ways in which our own minds are going to fight against the possibility of there being a third type. We're going to want to rewrite it to fit within whichever of the two mentalities. Just like he says in that paragraph you quoted, right? This is the thing, is that where previous cultures, let's say previous epochs, the ancient epoch and the medieval epoch, both said that the way we see the world wrong. And it's wrong either because nature is different than we expect it, like they used to say in the ancient world, or because what God says is right and what we say is wrong, like the medieval world used to say. There was always a reason why ourselves in our worldview. There was a higher authority over humanity, whether it was the one or the other, that was widely understood to be the source of truth and meaning. And we had to bow down our ego before that greater source of truth. In the world, the whole modernist proposition, as summed up by Pico della Mirandola and others, is that there is no higher source of truth. People are the very best. We're the pinnacle of evolution. The human mind is the best thing ever invented, and it totally sees the world objectively and truly. And so we don't worry our little brains about how there might be funhouse mirrors or warped lenses going on in our minds, because we see things the way they are. And what that really does is it gives our ego license to rewarp everything we look at to our heart's content, while absolutely certain we're doing no such thing.
Okay.
And that's what's going to make this next discussion very hard for us. It's going to make it very hard. And that's why the whole mythos versus logos discussion is hard, because mythos is the third mentality. Other two mentalities cannot produce mythos. That's why we have a logos culture, because we're hyper-Verstand, hyper-noetic, hyper-rationalist. And what hyper-rationalist cultures do is they build cultures of schemas and systems. That's what logos culture is. And they use that to attempt to replace what used to be developed as a mythos culture. And they do that by saying, myths aren't true. Myths are nonsense. We only deal in what's true, and what's true is what we say is true according to our systems. So we're going to erase all that past stuff, and we're just going to reason out for ourselves what's true, and we're going to agree on it, and then that's going to be the system. And even if it disagrees with the world, it's still true. That's the way we're going to do things. You see that, for example, as just an example, it was about 25, 30 years ago. There was a Supreme Court case in which a man was in prison for life for committing a murder. And he appealed it and made its way all the way up to Supreme Court. And the defense said, look, another guy has come forward and admitted that he committed the murder. So you have to let our client go free. And the Supreme Court was, no, we don't have to let you go free because you had your day in court and you didn't prove innocence. So you're guilty. It doesn't matter if somebody else did it. What matters is the system decided you're guilty, and therefore we have to punish you. So this is an example of what I mean about in the modern world, we let the schema override reality and say, it doesn't matter what's true. We're going to pretend that our schema is true, but when we're actually confronted with evidence that it's not, we're going to double down, dig heels and say, but it's okay because it leaves following our system, which is the important part. That's what it means to be in a logos culture. The system has been designed, it's systematic, and we commit to that system and to that schema as our saving grace to make civilization work. A mythos culture is a different kind of thing. And to talk about it, we have to talk about this third mentality, this third character type, and a third kind of culture that it generates that's different from the other two. Oh, is my audio breaking up? It says my audio might be breaking up.
The video is freezing a lot.
Yeah.
Video is freezing a lot, and occasionally the audio cuts out, and so it's sort of like just hanging on barely.
Okay, try it now. I've got two different home networks, and one's faster than the other. I was on the slow one. Now I'm on the faster one. Is this better?
Yeah.
Seems to be stabilizing.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Go with it.
I thought it was my reception actually.
Yeah, let's continue on and go with it until
okay.
Otherwise,
so we'll see how it goes from here. So the idea is that we've been going through Mythos and Logos. We're about halfway through it, and what we're doing here is partly going back and looking through for things that confused us. And as part of that process, we've been looking at the ways that he uses terminology differently than we expect. We've been looking at the way that what looks like text that he's written de novo turns out to contain references to other philosophers and philosophies, so that we can follow up those links and say, well, what does he really mean here? Is he bringing Hannah Arendt into this whole essay? And if so, what do I need to be reading in order to prepare for it? Yeah, Donald talked about that Kenneth Smith is sort of like, follow or don't follow, whatever. I'm going to plow ahead and I'm going to bring in all these references, and they're all necessary. So we've been doing that. But the big thing that we need to do to really get to the core of the difference between mythos culture and logos culture is that we need to talk about the third mentality and the third character type, because that's the source of mythos. That's where mythos comes from, and it can only come from there. Once you see how the three different mentalities work, it becomes clear that the other two mentalities could not possibly produce mythos. It's not the sort of thing they do. By their natures, they do different things. So that's the background, Sharon. I should have started there. You're right, but that's the background behind why we're digging into this. Donald mentioned this last week when he said that when you're reading Kenneth Smith, it really helps to understand his characterology schema that he gets from Arendt and Hegel and the Greeks, because it underlies everything. So after we finish the Mythos and Logos series of seminars, that'll be the next book we do. We'll do his human characterology series. But we can do it. We could do this bit now, and it'll reveal a lot.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Sharon?
Yes.
But I got to point out for someone who was talking about how confused she is, once again, you put your finger on the most potent sentence in that essay that exactly sums up what we've been talking about for the last half hour. So I don't think you're as confused as you say you are. That's very cool. All right. So why should there be a third thing? Why isn't two enough? Why one of the things about Kenneth Smith is that he's an existentialist philosopher. And as he says, all philosophy is either escapist or existentialist. And that's not original to him. Other philosophers have said that before him. But he says you're either dealing with the natural world and our own human nature as they actually are, or you are trying to escape reality into some schema that dictates how it ought to be. And so, for example, that's Hegel's criticism of Kant. Kant describes a rational mind capable of engaging in pure reason and making ethical decisions on the basis of reasoning it out. And he says you really shouldn't do any of that traditionalist, this is wrong because we traditionally say it's wrong. You shouldn't do any of that. That should all be excluded, and you should think your way through the problem. But as Hegel says, the problem is that people don't come in one model. We don't come in one model. We're not all angels of reason. We come in different models, and some of us can't do what Kant is demanding we do. And if we do what Kant wants and suppress all those other sources of authority over right and wrong, then the majority of human beings will engage in wrong behavior because they can't get the right answers following Kant's method. And what that means is that Kant is an escapist. Under the schema of philosophical systems, Kant is using escapist philosophy in which he's trying to dictate terms to reality and say human nature is like this, and therefore these things follow. But Hegel says you don't get to say what human nature is like. You have to study people, and you have to discover what human nature is like. Even if you don't like what you discover, you have to take it as it actually is, and you have to make your philosophy out of that. And the same is true of the world. You don't get to say this would all be nicer if change wasn't real, like Parmenides does. And you don't get to say, like Plato does, it would be nicer if there's a world of ideal forms of which we are all just various variants and reflections and shadows. You don't get to say that either. It doesn't matter if it would be nice for your schema. All of that's escapism. What matters is how is it really? And how are we going to live ethical, informed lives within that reality? And that's the basis for existentialism. So when Kenneth Smith lays out these different character types, he's not doing what Kant does. He's not saying, boy, my system would sure work if I had 3 character types. That would be great. Let me see if I can invent some reasons to have 3. Let me see. I will divide up the range of human possibilities and I'll write them down on a piece of paper and I'll make it be intellectually and emotionally satisfying that they're in these different 3 boxes. And then other people will also be satisfied when they see my boxes, and then they'll believe me because it pleases them. He says, absolutely not doing that. That would be escapism. And he's committed to not being an escapist philosopher. So what he's trying to do is say, how are people actually as we find them? And as we see from the very first essay in this collection, Mythos and Logos, from the first essay, we see we start as far away from the Kantian ideal as you can possibly imagine. As an infant, we are everything that would make it impossible to engage in what Kant engages in. This is what Hegel sees, right? This is Hegel's response. This is Smith's response. Arendt says the same thing. Nietzsche says the same thing. Kierkegaard says the same thing. Marx says the same thing. They all have their variants. They all have their different takes on it, but they're all making the same argument, which is there is not a single model of human being. And even a single human being doesn't stay put in a single mode of character.
Correct.
We begin very differently than we end up. And so, like Heraclitus tells us, we are in a state of becoming. We are rivers that are flowing. We are changing. Panta Rei, Plato said, was the summation of Heraclitus. All things flow, and that includes us. So the I that is trying to look at the world and understand it, and trying to look at the self and understand it, and trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong, is not a fixed, stable, Newtonian, Kantian position. It is in motion and transformation. It is becoming, changing from one thing to another. This is what Hegel says with his metaphor of the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. So these 3 things are totally different from each other. No one would mistake them for each other, and they operate according to different rules. And yet, they become each other. And that, although you can choose your moment of photography carefully in order to show a bud that is only a bud and nothing but a bud, and then a blossom that is only a blossom and couldn't be mistaken for a bud, and then a fruit that's different from the other. You can choose those moments and create a vision of the world that involves these static things. The truth is dynamic, that you can also go at other times and catch the bud when it's neither a bud nor a blossom, but somewhere in between on its journey. And these are the photos that people frequently don't share because they don't satisfy our tidy categories, but they're the most interesting ones. When the teeny tiny little bit of an apple is beginning to emerge as the base of the flower begins to swell, but it's not a fruit yet, and it's not just a flower anymore. It's somewhere in between, and it's in movement. And it's not in between in a stable sense. It hasn't achieved some kind of perfection from balance, right? We're not talking about centrism here. The belief that we don't want to be extremist and we should go to the middle, which is a huge reflex. We're not talking about that because there's no staying in the middle, right? The blossom as it becomes the fruit never just stops in the middle and then just hangs out on the tree for the next 10 years in that state. It isn't possible. It's changing, right? That's not a stable state. It's moving through it. So Hegel says our characters also transform. Our mentalities also transform. from one to another. And they don't transform arbitrarily because we will it. They transform according to the lawful rules of nature, according to the principles of nature. Nature determines our transformation. When we look at the bud becoming the blossom, becoming the fruit, it is the biology in harmony with the seasons around it and the climate that are controlling the pace and the nature of that transformation. When we look at a human mind, as Heraclitus says, there is a nature outside of us and there is also a nature inside of us.
Yes.
Even our own feelings and our own minds are lawful, whether we understand those laws or not. Just like the development of a fruit is lawful, whether we understand biology and climatology or not. So there are hidden things at work within us that are shaping us and shaping our transformations. And if we don't learn those laws, those inner nature laws, as well as the outer nature laws, then we're always going to remain obscure to ourselves. We won't understand why we're doing the things we do. We may have models about ourselves. We may imagine that we are consciously, willfully, objectively seeing everything the way it is and making, informed, rational choices about what we're going to do. But that doesn't make any of that true about ourselves. Kant can say that a newborn infant you ought to make decisions ethically, but it isn't going to happen because that's not the newborn infant's nature. So this is what I mean about the existentialist. This is why I'm emphasizing this part. This is the last gateway before we get into the third mentality, is that this schema is not based on the way Kenneth Smith wants it to be, or Hegel or Marx or anybody else. This is based on the struggle to try to get over our feelings and to get over our ideas and to really grapple with what is the actual human being in front of us and how does it transform over time. And then to try to say that as clearly as we can and see what the consequences are. Dave, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I also think there is one other aspect of Ken Smith's work, which I think is really important here, and that's the metaphysical aspect. And so even in his conversation on Hegel, for example, on page 113, I'm looking at that first paragraph, he talks about one of the most remarkable fruits of Hegel's work is the insight into the primal types of powers and the extraordinary power of spirit to reconcile these powers. So the concept of spirit entering into this equation here, I think, really validates the emphasis on myth. And what they offer is a unified perspective of the whole, which works in counterbalance to the atomizing perspective of, let's call it logos culture or materialism, something that divides things into their component boxes. This is where we're unifying together, and I think is a really important aspect here.
Boy, I'm glad you brought that one up. Yeah, so that's in essay Soul and Spirit and Ego. That's in section 7.7 on page 113. And, even though we haven't gotten to that essay yet, the whole reason all these essays are together in this book is that they all inform each other. As we talked about before with Kenneth Smith, the way that he writes, he knows you're not going to understand him the first time through. It's just not possible because he's not using the words the way you use them. And he's not putting the ideas together the way you put them together. And so it takes multiple repeated exposure of passing through, not in order to agree with him, but before you actually understand what he's trying to say, so you can make up your mind whether you agree with him. There's this funny thing happens with Kenneth Smith where we have an immediate reaction to him, usually negative, because we don't like what he's saying, but that reaction happens long before we actually understand what he's saying. We think we know what he means, but actually we know what we would have meant if we had written those words. And so it takes multiple passes to start to see, oh, he doesn't use that word that way. He uses it the way that Hannah Arendt uses it. And now we understand why. And oh, this word is not the way we use it in everyday conversation. That's a reference to Hegel's, schema of whatever. And as you begin to put those pieces together, it becomes possible to read Kenneth Smith the way that he meant it. And then finally, we're ready to make up our minds about whether we agree with him or not. And so as a result, this thing may be in essay 7, but it applies directly to what we're talking about right now. These numbered 1, 2, and 3 are talking about the 3 mentalities, the 3 faculties of the mind that we're talking about. So one of the most remarkable fruits of Hegel's work is his insight into the primal types of powers, definitive of the different strata and modes of human subjectivity. This goes to what Ayala was talking about before, the understanding that the mind is not a whole, that it has faculties that are at work, sometimes against each other, in conflict with each other, and that frequently are in operation unaware of each other, even though the thoughts and feelings they produce end up being the results of them all being at work in there. There's a lot going on in the mind. It isn't just a truth organ. And so he numbers them. And the first is the self-cohesion of immediacy. And boy, is this Hegelian. The self-cohesion of immediacy in its basal and passive ineptitude to objectify, to define, to conceptualize, or to criticize anything. And this is what Hegel calls Begriff. But when he's talking about it in terms of the schema, he calls it an sich sein, which is being in itself. The infant is. The infant is more who they are than we will ever be again in our lives, because we begin the process of abstracting from ourselves almost immediately. And the more control we get over ourselves, the more we abstract from ourselves, the less we are ourselves, and the more we become kind of schismed. We become two people, the observer and decider on the one hand, and the experiencer on the other. So when we are in a pure Begriff an sich sein mode, we are being in itself. And what we grow into is the objectifying and alienative powers of conscious ego, which is für sich sein, being for itself. And it's for itself because it decides for itself who it wants to be. It's the ego making up its mind about who it's going to be, rather than merely being. And because it makes up its mind, it's able to not only decide who it wants to be, it's able to decide what does it want to change in the world around it. Maybe I don't want that tiger to eat me. Maybe I should get up and run away. Maybe I should domesticate the tiger and make it my pet. It's like you can start to envision a different world when you leave behind being in itself and enter the world of being for itself. You could decide for yourself who you want to be and what you want to do. But as he says, these have limitations. And so what we need is the third mentality, which we're about to talk about, which is the extraordinary powers of spirit to reconcile or synthesize these modes. And of course, Hegel spinning in his grave at Kenneth Smith's use of the word synthesis here, but we'll let that go. To synthesize modes 1 and 2 into a higher order union, an und für sich sein, when you can simultaneously be in yourself but also for yourself, to do both at the same time. What this sentence doesn't make clear, which I've been stressing today, is the way that being in itself and being for itself are so hostile to each other. It's like taking two magnets and trying to put the north ends of both of them together. They repel each other. They just won't go. The moment you let go of them, they bounce off each other again. And so when we talk about synthesizing them into a higher order union, we're talking about something that is much, much, much harder than it sounds like it is. Because to be in yourself is not to abstract, right? If you're abstracting, you're divided from yourself. Whereas to be for yourself is to abstract. It means it is to be divided. And because you're divided, you're not in yourself anymore. Part of you is separated from yourself, observing. So how can you both be separated from yourself and also a whole that is in yourself? They're opposites, they're contradictions.
And if you read half a more sentence, he talks about being in constant warfare with one another, just as you point out.
Yes.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yes, in circumstances where spirit is not feasible or active to mediate the lower order modes, then immediacy, that is an sich sein, and alienative consciousness, that is für sich sein, are going to be repeatedly cycling through forms of warfare with one another, right? They hate each other. And they don't hate each other in a simple, direct way in which they understand each other and therefore dislike each other. They repel each other in that they are incomprehensible to each other, and that the process of trying to dilate the mind to encompass the other breaks up the mode of mind that we so cherish about the way that we are. If we love being a whole immersed in the world, the work that it takes to even imagine what it would be like to be divided against yourself hurts like being stabbed with a knife. Your brain does not want to do it. You have to divide from yourself to understand what dividing from yourself means. And the whole point of being in itself is to not divide from yourself. And conversely, the thing that being for yourself wants to avoid more than anything is to fall back into the mire as it sees it, the trap, the helplessness, the passivity of being naively plugged into the world. All the power and self-control came from dividing yourself. The last thing you want to do is go back to what you imagine, what you visualize as being gibbering and drooling and pooping on yourself. You know, the person who has separated himself into the intellectualized state just can't stand the idea of going back to a state of helpless immediacy, of complete pathos in their relationship to life. So they just won't go. Phil and then Ayala, and then we'll pick this up.
Yeah, I'm anxious to show you an object.
Yeah, show me the object. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. You were going to do that.
One of the most treasured objects of my collection. I got this little, you know, like sometimes when I show things, I only see myself in a small screen because this might be important to see it, you know, enlarged. Anyway, well, I went hiking, and I saw this, and I said, God, that's a brain, you know, but it's kind of ironic because it's frozen as a rock. And so here it is.
Let's see it.
So if you can see it. And this was, I found this in nature. So finding things is kind of interesting. And I'm thinking, like, as you're talking about this idea, is like, I mean, I don't know if I understand the third way, but I certainly understand the unfolding process of becoming something else. Okay. And I guess this is ironic because quite often I think of this as like my second brain.
Nice.
But I dread it because it sort of become petrified. And it no longer changes, or at least changes so slowly I can't tell. So I think this is a state that I do not want to be in because it's no longer unfolding. And so I like to keep this other mind around to remind me that this is not, even though it's my mind, this is not what I want to be. Right. It's like, so it's kind of interesting. I went to a meeting at some point at this meetup group I no longer belong to that was about brain things. Okay. And there's one thing, one meeting, the leader of the group brought up the second brain, you know, which essentially is like your nervous system and your gut and all that kind of stuff. And after hearing that, okay, that sort of makes sense because that's part of your whole. And I brought this object. I said, I also have a second brain.
And here it is.
Second brain. And I passed it around, and it was interesting. It's like, here it is. And I was so surprised because, like, it was kind of tucked under a bush, but there it was. Like, anybody hiking could have found it, but nobody found it. I found the petrified brain.
It was waiting
you
for
know,
you,
like
Phil.
the dinosaur. And so, like, that's kind of interesting. And I think that constantly reminds me that's not what I want to be.
Right.
I want to be unfolding. Right. So I think that's kind of right along the lines of what you're talking about, except I have it, I guess, objectify in an object.
Yes. God, that's handy. Wow. Thank you, Phil. Ayala, go ahead.
Yeah, that Vernunft, being in and for itself, is something that we discussed. I just discussed with another group where the focus was purpose. Are we really purposeful beings or not? I think, you know, that is true that you have, and that's the way I understand it. the in itself is the being, the experience, detached from any meta-consciousness, from thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, and for itself is all the thoughts that we have about the experience, and they tend to be okay. They could be a mythos, but they don't have to be at war at all. What I agree is that they can't coexist exactly simultaneously.
Right.
So, but they can enhance each other.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of aesthetics, being in appreciating, being in nature, feeling like free, feeling like an animal, looking and immersing oneself in an art project or in watching a piece of art. The experience can be so overwhelming, and what enhances it is knowing it, thinking about what a feeling. I feel like one with nature. I feel that I belong. And I mean, speech, yeah, and the thoughts are better than the way I can articulate it here.
Yeah, it's potent, right? It's an incredible feeling.
Yes, yes, it's wonderful. So I think both of them, yeah, but separate from each other, I see them as deficient, as living only partially.
Yes. Yes, that's what we're going to talk about next. That
Well, not only living partially, it just seems to me even if you were being for itself or being in itself or being for itself, it changes. Like you want one thing and then you want another thing and you want
Right.
another thing. It's like this is all part of being. Is
Right.
that it transformed, and if, in terms of like being for itself, it also changes. So the problem is that in some sense, like if you get to a point that they become, as I say, petrified, then in a sense, you're not even conscious of being in itself, because there
yeah.
you are. You're
Yeah, you
not
don't know.
transforming. So therefore, in a sense, the transformation, the process itself, has got to be something, and we somehow, I think, in either case, make it sort of like, I guess, in one case, so momentary that it's petrified, and the other one is so sort of ideally bound that it's petrified. I mean, that's the thing, is that you don't allow yourself to experience the process itself, even if you're just being for itself. It actually just does change.
That's right. Sharon, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
No, I did not. I guess
Okay,
I didn't
sorry.
take it down. I'm sorry.
No problem. So, no, I meant your actual hand. not your virtual hand. Okay, so Richard in the comments asked, about a half an hour ago if I might move on to discussing the third faculty, and I'm getting there. I'm setting the stage, and I have to do it in a certain way because there are certain stereotypical ways to misunderstand the third type that are inescapable unless you know that they are certain caricatured ways of misinterpreting it. Unless you know you're going to do this, you will do it and think that you have successfully understood the thing. So I'm doing a process of sort of ruling out those caricatures. And I'm doing it by showing the relationship of these two types to each other. But I'm almost there. I'm almost ready to do it. So there's two more things to know. The first one is that, Verstand especially, but Begriff as well in its way, once it has some Verstand serving it. We talked about them not being pure, but being servant-master relationships. What is your source of meaning and truth and right and wrong? Is it what you think and the systems that you buy into, or is it what you feel and experience? Which one is in charge? And whichever one that is, you use the other faculty as the servant. to help it be more effective. So even the most begriff adult has an enormous amount of Verstand activity, right? Our mind is got both faculties. It's just that they're using their logic and their analysis and their reasoning in order to reach the conclusions that feel good to them, that they like, right? It pleases me, placita. Kenneth Smith calls these that we use placita instead of principles. We and we do it all the time at in incredibly subtle ways, so that we say, well, that conclusion is not warranted or is not well justified. We could be looking at the best justified conclusion in the world with the most impeccable logic, but if we don't like it, we're going to see flaws all over it, and we're going to say, well, that's not a reasonable conclusion to reach. And of course, we're wrong, but we don't know we're wrong because we're not actually being guided by the logic we think we're being guided by. We're being guided by our feeling about the logic, right? And we're rearranging the truth in order to fit the preconception that we want to arrive at. And the same works in reverse. When people are talking about their feelings and whose feelings are right. I don't know if you've ever watched one of these arguments, but it happens all as Ayala can tell us, you see it in therapy all the time, where two people come in with strong emotions, and the debate that they want to get into is whose feelings are right, who deserves to be angry, and who should just stop it, because their feelings are wrong and my feelings are right. And what you discover is, as long as you let them have the argument at that begriff level, it is unresolvable, because there is no way to answer the question whose feelings are right. They're both actually having the feelings, right? I mean, this is part of what therapy is about, is learning to accept that emotions are real things and they're really going on, and you don't just get to just, suppress into the background the ones that are inconvenient for you. But that's what a begriff wants to do, right? A begriff wants to, play with the foreground background with the experience of life. So the problem is that as the begriff personality or the Verstand personality interacts with the world, and the world is constantly showing them things, some of which are easy to translate into the worldview they have, and others of which seem to disprove their worldview. What they do is they, over time, get more sophisticated about collecting evidence and rationalizations that prove that the way they see the world is right, and that they shouldn't worry about that contradictory evidence. Oh, I know it looks contradictory, but actually it's not, because, and then they replay the tape recorder that they've memorized of why it is that they don't have to pay any attention to that contrary evidence. The world is constantly knocking on their head trying to get in, and they're constantly saying, oh, hello world, yes, come sit over here and I'll pour you some tea and do those things that I do that allows me to turn you around and put you right back out the door shortly, without my ever having been challenged at the fundamental level that you were offering me. You were offering me an opportunity to escape the trap of my mind, and I managed to judo you right back out the door. And now I feel like I understand it better, when what I've really done is understand it worse, because now there's more defenses that I've erected between me and the truth. And the fact that they're sophisticated and convincing to me, I take as evidence that I'm right, instead of taking as evidence that I seem to be working awfully hard to avoid certain conclusions, right? Part of the fun that therapists have in therapy when they're listening to people is, wow, you're really working hard to reach that conclusion, aren't you? It's like they notice, because they're not invested in the idea. They can hear all the energy that's going into avoiding dealing with the thing that they don't want to deal with. So Kenneth Smith uses Greek mythology a lot as a metaphor to help us understand these things. And in both cases, in the begriff case and the Verstand case, the metaphor of the labyrinth, Daedalus and the labyrinth, is just as valuable to this. And this is our gateway to getting into the third type. It's just as valuable to this as the Procrustean bed is. And the reason is, in what we think of as the liberating process of thinking or using our mind, what we're actually doing is extending the labyrinth that has us trapped to encompass more of the terrain around us and make it submit to the shape of the labyrinth. So that what could have been a liberating insight instead gets inverted and turned into another brick in the wall that reinforces the trap that we're in. There's some parables in Otherwise and Webb's, where Kenneth Smith talks about the way that people think that what's in their mind is most distinctively their own, when the truth is most of what's in there has been put there by propaganda, advertising, and so forth.
Yeah.
It's the least their own. Of all the things in their lives, among the things that is least personal and least under their control is the stuff that has been put into their head and that they've used to construct the labyrinth that cuts them off from reality. As Richard just posted, mimetic desire, right? And Dave, quotes the labyrinth. You're going to see the labyrinth come up over and over in Kenneth Smith's writing. He's always talking about this, the way that the very processes that we use that ought to liberate us, because of the way we have fallen into one of these two mentalities, instead we get a tragic inversion, like Oedipus, before he figures out, in the first Oedipus, in Oedipus Tyrannus, before he understands what's happening, while he's king, while he's trying to solve the mystery of what it is that plagues Thebes, every step he takes that ought to bring him, closer to truth and escape from the problem is instead somehow not helping at all. And everything is inverted. His virtues have become vices, and they're working against him. That's what it's like when a begriff person tries to find their way out of their begriff worldview. They build the labyrinth of begriff instead of shrinking it, and they become more trapped than they were when they started.
You mean Verstand?
It's the same for Verstand.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Griffs do it in an emotionalist, experiential way, and Verstandts do it in an intellectual, schematic way. They both use the resource that they've committed to, the faculty, and they use it to build a different kind of labyrinth, but it has the same kind of result. That there's a greater and greater distance between themselves and the enormous amount of evidence that's out there in the actual world right in front of their faces that could tell them where they're wrong and help them to escape the trap. This is why when Heraclitus says that we're sleepwalkers, he's talking about the same problem that Kenneth Smith talks about when he says we're stuck in a labyrinth. And furthermore, we're stuck in a labyrinth the way that Daedalus was stuck in a labyrinth. He built the labyrinth. And when all of us are Daedaluses in our lives, we are still building the labyrinth. Every step we take, every time we reason, every time we talk, we're building the labyrinth bigger and bigger and cutting ourselves off further and further. And this is the existential crisis of epistemology that the human condition gives us if we can't find a way out of the trap of these initial two naive mentalities, these, as he says, basal metabolic levels of the brain. Ayala and then Phil. Go ahead, Ayala.
Yes, I like very much the metaphor of the labyrinth. And I think you articulated that existential barricade that we have to reality. I think all of us say that we are striving to know the truth. But do we really?
Right.
And the truth is built. There are many cognitive barriers here, but I think the main one is what Dave always stresses, the fact that everything is in change.
Yeah.
And there is a very deep fear in not only initiating change, but even recognizing change. The barricade is to improve our lives for survival. It looks like it's totally irrational.
Yes.
Because it's anti-survival, it's anti-improvement. But the fear, and psychoanalysis long ago kind of focused on the fear of separation. And the separation is not just from mother's womb. The separation is from anything familiar to us.
Right.
So you spoke about patterns of thinking or scripts or myths. Let's talk about mythos. Most of us have developed in life some kind of mythos about who we are and who the world is.
Yeah.
And the relationship between us. And even though we are in change, the world is in change, everything is in change, we stick to those patterns of looking at it in reality.
Right.
So for us, it is all the same over and over again. That's all.
Yeah, it's good stuff. You know, there are ways that in popular culture they describe psychology in ways that allow them to ridicule it or to deal with it as a surface phenomena. But the goals of psychology and psychiatry and the experiences of highly experienced psychologists and psychiatrists turn up all kinds of things about the structure of the human mind and the core mental faculties that could help to liberate us if we could see them for what they truly are. And so, you know, as I talk about these things I'm talking about from Kenneth Smith's philosophical schema, you know, it's part of why I keep going back to Ayala is, you know, she's got the background. She's seen people do these things in ways that in therapy are more obvious and crystal clear than they would ever allow themselves to do on the street or in their normal interactions. There's the normally we're so much more defensive and protected because we know we shouldn't be saying things that will cause people to judge us. Yeah, but when we think that it's safe, what we actually, you know, in therapy, we actually resort some of our behavior and some of the things that we normally hide or obscure from ourselves and others, we allow to come out. And in the course of doing that, still other things we didn't want to reveal also come out. And so the therapist has to have been trained intensively how to listen in a very different way to notice all those things going on, those, you know, the ways in which schemas of excuses and logic and rationalization are often built on top of some deep emotional experiential thing that the person is not aware of at all, but that is a living force in their lives. So this is the kind of general shape of what Kenneth Smith's getting at when he builds off of Hegel and Arendt and Kierkegaard and the others is he's talking about the fact that there's this basal metabolism of the mind that controls how it evaluates what's true and how it evaluates what's right and how it evaluates who does it think that it is. So Phil, then Donald, and James, I guess. Go ahead, Phil.
So once again, it comes back to being a human being. It seems like there's two problems. One is the world is constantly changing, and you don't account for that fast enough or an appropriate time. The other one is like a kind of arrogance you build up. And so the lack of a degree of humility because you think you've got it. This reminds me of the Peloponnesian War. Now, I'm not an expert in it, but I know the essential of what happened. Athens and Sparta was always in conflict to a degree, and the degree got more intense. And so the Athenians was wise in some sense that because they were a seafaring culture that did a lot of trade, they decided it was very important to not only have the city wall, but to build the wall around and down to the port of Piraeus in order to protect the port as well, because that was necessary for them. And the way they reasoned was that it doesn't matter whether we have a more powerful army or Sparta has a more powerful army, we have the wall. And and let's say they overtake the land, we're going to survive because we just sail and export stuff and transport stuff, and we could survive almost indefinitely, right? Because and the Spartans understood the importance of that wall to Piraeus. So that's when it really wrapped up. And as long as things didn't change, and they could stick to that thing, and it probably works pretty well in terms of what their scheme is. But unfortunately, a plague broke out at the condition changed, right? Now,
Yes.
you can't really have your sea power trading very well. Other people might not want your goods going in and out. You know, you might not have the sailors to sail the ship in and out. So the whole scheme depends on the fact that you could protect Piraeus in order for you to sustain the city at a time of war. Well, that didn't happen. And Sparta eventually won, right? because they were arrogant enough to know that things will go on forever. They were arrogant enough to understand that their scheme was a hell of a lot smarter than the Spartans, even though they had more brute force maybe. So I think if the condition might not have changed, it might have been different. If they weren't as arrogant, it might have been different, right? Because I certainly root for Athens, but nonetheless, they just overstepped what they thought they were, and kind of like Oedipus, right? In that sense, right? So I think we have to, no matter how smart or no matter how whatever we are, we have to always step back and realize that we could be mistaken.
Right.
And the way you explain, for instance, the 2008 house bubble, well, it was a fluke, that happened. The bubble burst, and we're going to get back to it. Well, like I said, the Democrat tried to change the rules so the banks wouldn't fail, so you don't have to bail everybody out. So nobody will have to, even the poor people don't have to suffer and lose all their houses.
Yeah.
And so the rich people can rake it up. So I think that not only do you have to blame the world for changing, which it does, but you have to also blame yourself if you
Yes.
overstep what your limitations are.
Yes. Thank you for that, Phil. And I second the reference to Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. It is simply one of the most important books written in classical Greek. It's so, if you don't treat it as something you have to rush through, if you treat it as something that you can take in small bites and think about, and just work your way through it over however long it takes you, it is just incredibly enlightening to read, because it's written by an Athenian. I think Thucydides was an Athenian, and he's writing about how his own city wrecked everything good that it had going for it. Ultimately, it's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy written written by someone with a taste for exposing one's own problems instead of covering them up or excusing them. There's a passage in the Peloponnesian War where Thucydides is leading one of the military engagements, and he screws it up, and they lose that engagement, and he says so. It's like you would so not read that in most modernist tellings of somebody's activities. They mostly want to tell you what a winner they are and how great they are, how something wasn't their fault. And here's Thucydides writing his own history, which he knows is for the ages, about this incredibly important time. And he's saying, wow, I really blew it here. And it's so refreshing. The whole book is just like a breath of fresh air and deeply enlightening. Donald, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to drop off for a while.
Well, welcome back.
But you didn't miss me, did you?
We did.
I just heard psychology, and that's a hot button no. I know Kenneth very much liked Oliver Sacks and read his case studies and stuff. And I believe also A.R. Luria was a Russian pioneer in this field who had thousands of Russian soldiers with brain injuries as a result of the Second World War, and came up with some really, I don't know, the books are just stunning to read, like Sacks, of how the brain works, really how the brain works.
Yeah.
Not how we imagine it's working.
Right. Right.
And I will second, I have read several Thucydides in several translations, and actually the annotated versions that are currently available with all the maps, the little bios of the major characters and stuff
That would be amazing.
Are very good, very good. And I think, I don't know if Phil was, I think, right on in his capsule, in little summary of the Peloponnesian War, but I don't know that it's appreciated by us how threatening Athens had a scheme to become invulnerable to other city-states. They were the sea power. They built the wall that broke 200 or 300 years of history where, okay, the phalanx goes out every summer. They have a very short campaign. Nobody dies, or few people die. They erect a monument and they say, Thebes was right. Athens was right. In this dispute, it was resolved. But in building this wall, in sourcing its food from the Black Sea, putting its vital resources outside the reach of the other Greek city-states, sort of, wait a minute, that's unfair. We're supposed to be able to march to some place on some field somewhere and have our go at it. And this happened almost every summer. I think the statistics that I've read are like 2 out of every 3 summers, the hoplites, the real citizens of the city, assembled and settled whatever differences they had with other cities. And it was, and sort of the threat isn't that, is that Athens said, we can become invulnerable to that. We don't have to settle things like Greeks.
Yeah.
They became somewhat un-Greek.
Yes.
Enough of that.
It's great stuff. And it sounds like I really should read a modern translation, because I would love to read it with all the maps and the little capsule bios of who the people are. I mean, even Socrates shows up in this history. There's a vote, and he's one of the people who has the vote and, casts his vote. It's like, oh my God.
He's a hoplite. He goes and fights. He's at Potidaea. I don't remember.
It's a hell of a history.
It's
a hell of a history. And if you read it while simultaneously remembering that the Greeks had engineered their entire civilization to try to avoid a repeat of the Trojan War, that they're doing everything in their power to avoid tearing themselves to pieces. Mm-hmm. And what do? Oh God, they tore themselves to pieces. The whole reason they were conquered by Macedonia later was because of what began with the Peloponnesian War and with Athenian incitement of the war. So there is this sense in which there is this large-scale civilizational historical tragedy working out, and it's working out in front of the people who know better than anyone what that tragedy is, and are doing, in theory, everything in their power to try to avoid the tragedy, and yet somehow they're making it happen instead of preventing it. It's really incredible reading. So we're down to our final. Oh, Richard, go ahead.
I see so much of the parallels, like with kind of basically Athens, basically like kind of, changing the rules so that they can no longer be held accountable, to their peers and neighbors, which is like, like corporate interests and like in our society. Like we sort of live in this kind of this facade of like, okay, we're beyond violence and what now. And now they basically erect all these like these moats and like walls, like, from like tort reform, from which like say like the, McDonald's hot coffee thing was basically twisted into a narrative of that. And like, additionally then, right, forcing, more and more quote accountability through, mediations, which they control, like who they hire as like these services, and then basically stacking the courts. But it's not a stable situation, if we look at human nature. So yeah, right. They're trying to make themselves more stable, and in the process they're removing the outlets for resolution of problems from the powerless, which makes the powerless angrier and angrier over time, which makes the situation less stable. So again, there's a tragic inversion happening where the very thing they're working towards is actually undoing the reason that they're working towards it. And this is what happens with the mind itself, with these two forms of basal metabolism. It's why Kenneth keeps calling them basal metabolism. It's like they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. It's like in your brain, you are supposed to have a cerebellum and a cerebrum. You are not just supposed to have a brainstem. If all you have is a brainstem, you're not able to live a human life. You're missing too much. And this is how Kenneth characterizes Begriff and Verstand.
He says, and it's what's hard for us is that as moderns, we have been flattened down into a world in which we are expected to role play Begriff and Verstand ways of life exclusively. And what most of us end up doing is we compartmentalize and chop our lives into pieces where we have different roles we play under different circumstances. And in one role, we're more Begriff, we're more passive, like with the police. You don't dare be active. You have to submit and be passive because you don't want to die, right? And in other, or in a court, even if you're angry, you can't just insult the judge, right? Because the consequences are dire. So there's all these situations in which we have to act one set of ways, but then under different circumstances, like maybe on the job or what have you, we have to act in a completely different set of ways. And so we get these schizoid characters where we're fragmented and we're sort of hopping back and forth from day to day, week to week between which role we're playing. And all of this, even when we're hopping from Verstand to Begriff, is a Verstand thing to do, because the infant never hops from one mode to another. The infant is their mode. They don't have meta states that they can transition into. So intrinsically, it sort of underscores the extent to which even the Begriff under modernism have been highly colonized with Verstand approaches to the world and to life and to thinking and to seeing. They're using a lot of those tools, and it's affecting the kind of Begriff that they are. So this sets up the problem so that now in the remaining 46 minutes, I can take us through the third character type. But first, Donald.
There's a great scene in a W.C. Fields movie where he's appearing in court and he's being his normal smart aleck, and the judge says, "Are you showing contempt for this court?" And Fields responds, "No, Your Honor, I'm trying to hide it."
Right? There it is, right in a nutshell. I'm trying to not be myself, because if I were myself, I'd go to jail right now. Yes. This is the existential modernist condition, right? In which we could, if we lose our jobs, we lose our health insurance, then we get sick and die. We could lose our housing and then we're homeless. We lose our food and then we're hungry. Everything is in a state of threatened deprivation. And that's to motivate us to produce, right? And it's artificial. Everything about it is artificial. And it encourages a certain Verstand approach to life, which is a schematizing, strategizing, abstracting, planning ahead way of interacting with the world. So the problem is, if we want real epistemology or real axiology, if we want to know what's true and we want to know what's good, we can't ask a Begriff, a strictly Begriff mind, to give us the answer. And we can't ask a strictly Verstand mind to give us the answer, because the Begriff mind is going to tell us what they experience as true or good, what they feel is true or good. And the Verstand mind is going to give us what they think is true or good. They're both letting the faculty be in charge of reality. Now, this is the critical point. This is what makes them both basal metabolism. I almost every week I post this, but there's a reason. It's the word idiot. Idiota equals one's own. The thing that characterizes both of these basal metabolisms of the mind is that we are obsessed with our own faculty and its conclusions, right? What makes someone an idiot is that they're parochial. They could be the smartest person in the world, but as long as they are obsessed with their collectibles and their feelings and their ideas and their hobbies and their family and their religion and their country, they're an idiot. Because what they're doing is they're monomaniacally narrowing their perspective on the world to a single perspective. And that violates the fundamental law of epistemology that's the basis for existential philosophy, which is that it is impossible for any single human mortal perspective to encompass the truth, or right or wrong. The cosmos is bigger than we are. It's more complex than we are. It's more sophisticated than we are. And we can't get it into our head without doing violence to it. By the time it ends up in our head, it's a caricature. So the only way to approximate the truth or to approximate right or wrong is to have more than one perspective, which is the thing that neither a Begriff nor a Verstand want to do. The Begriff wants to experience life directly, as a whole, as a unit, as one, therefore from one perspective. And the Verstand has tried to organize everything in his mind systematically so that the system of thinking will tell him what's true and what's good. And that system has been fine-tuned over a lifetime to be the answer. This is how you get the answer. And the last thing in the world that they want is to hear the idea that no single human system can produce the truth, or right or wrong. It can only produce a caricature of it. So they both fight against the very thing they most need to do. They are, in Kenneth Smith's words, and in the words of a lot of existential philosophers, what they, for all that they hate each other and think that they're opposites of each other, they are identical in the sense that they are both idiotic, half-witted, egotistical, self-involved relationships to the world. They both begin with the premise that one or the other of the mental faculties should be in charge, as though it were up to human beings to decide what's true or what's good. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a personal example that kind of demonstrates this in a way. When I was at Penn State, I had a kind of feud with them and, eventually left, It's a question whether I left because I didn't want to be there or whether they fired me.
Right.
I was supposed to turn in my stuff for promotion. I didn't do it. And the dean wrote a nasty letter, says, insofar as you did not turn in your review material, the university could hardly renew your contract. Okay. So like I said, all depends. Well, I needed a job very badly, like I was always competitive. So, like being particularly dismissed from a fairly well-known university. And, at that time, I got a strange call from Morehouse College. Now, Morehouse College is a college where Martin Luther King went to. It's a very prestigious Black college. So, and I needed a job very badly. And they wanted me to apply. They didn't offer me the job, but they want me to apply. So I was puzzled, like, why? What did they hear about me to begin with? Number one, okay? And number two, I thought about it, and I finally told them that no, I won't apply. And there was two reasons. There were two personal reasons. One is I felt enough dissonance from the Black culture that I would feel, I would be constantly uncomfortable in the environment. So that was a personal reason. But I also thought, I knew my art. I knew, even though I was Chinese, essentially Western art. And I did not want to put myself in a position to colonialize the population by teaching them what I knew. I would have to understand what the hell they are and maybe fuse that in some way. So in that sense, I turned it down because I was afraid of my own limitations, that I would end up be a colonialist in some form.
Yeah.
And so that, in a sense, it was, even though I did not understand that culture enough, although parts of it I appreciate, I did not understand enough. I did not feel in sync with them enough that I would, act like the Papa man that come now. I'm going to come teach you what things are about, right? Because they're coming from a different perspective. And I learned this when I was working at the Lower Museum of Anthropology. There's a museum with a lot of American Indian stuff that I really admire, I love. And I was working as an assistant photographer when I was in graduate school. And so one day I came by and I saw a bunch of Indians. I mean, they weren't dressed in headdress. But that they were Indians. And they came back again, like a couple of weeks later, and I was like wondering what the hell was happening. So I asked a couple people, and then the guy who was working with them, he said, no, I'm teaching them basket weaving. And I was shocked. I was shaken to my core. Like, here are people who have so totally been abused that they've lost their culture, that they have to learn the culture from an anthropologist.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I said, oh no. And that part actually informed me about going to Morehouse College. That no, they're not that desperate. And it's like,
They could have
how,
handled you.
yeah, no, I mean, how dejected these people must be to say, now we have to learn about ourselves from not even another craftsman, but from an anthropologist, because he's
Yes.
the only one to know that culture in the most academic way, right? And it's like, my gosh. And then later on, of course, this is much later, I saw the movie Smoke Signal, made by
Isn't that great?
It's a great movie.
Oh my God.
And I heard an interview with the director once, and he said, like, he wanted to make a movie that sort of showed the internal structure of the thing. And he said his people was left in a very strange way, because when he was little, his friends, kids, other kids, they would play cowboy and Indians, and everyone wanted to be a cowboy.
Yeah.
Like, my goodness.
Yeah.
My goodness.
That's what colonization does.
We had done a number. So you have to be careful, even if you want to be helpful to others, that you are in the right state of mind and the right background to help. Otherwise, unknowing to you, you could end up being a colonialist and imposing your understanding onto somebody else. Not that your understanding is totally useless, but it has to be somehow coordinated in some way. You have to be competent. Otherwise, you are exploiting.
Right.
Unconsciously.
Thank you for that, Phil. That's so important. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, I had to listen to Phil as he completed what he said. And as you talk about Begriff and Verstand and Vermouth, what I get from all of that is the human spirit and how expansive you decide you are going to be, because life is a continuous learning experience. If you had gone to Morehouse, I guarantee you, my son went there for 4 years, you would have enlarged yourself completely. I'm from the Caribbean, and that was African-American culture at its core, and I learned a lot. Nice. I did not prejudge it before I got there. And that's part of the human experience. And that's what make Vermouth, the what in itself, what is it you said? In and for itself. Is your capacity and your willingness to expand.
Yes. Yes, well, and so let's talk about Vernunft. So this is what Richard has been pinging me about in the chats. It's like, we are going to get to that third type, aren't we? It's like, yeah, we've set it up now. So you may recall a metaphor that I used some months ago that Kenneth Smith says that philosophy, real philosophy, is like dislocating your shoulder so that it can move to unaccustomed directions. That if you actually try rotating your shoulders around, you'll find there's things you can't reach behind you. There's an arc of motion that's denied to you because of the shape of your joint. The joint won't let you do it. And the only way you could reach that part of your back is to dislocate your arm. And that would liberate the ball from the socket enough that you can reach further back and touch the untouchable part of your back. And he says that's what it's like with the mind, with character. As long as you stay in the socket of Begriff or stay in the socket of Verstand, you can only see the world in the ways that mentality socket allows you to reach. But if you can dislocate the socket of your mind, you can move it to new positions. And one of the first things that you can do, which Phil does, as he tells us repeatedly in different ways in the art that he does, is you can make yourself do a non-Verstand thing in the way that you approach a creative act, even if the rest of the time you live in a Verstand way. You can compel yourself to do something creative that you don't understand at the time you do it, and then come back and look at it and learn from what happened. And so what just happened there is that you forced yourself out of the one socket and into the other. In truth, we have practice hopping back and forth between the two, but we do it unconsciously and don't know that we're doing it, and we think that we're a whole. As Ayala talked about, we imagine that we're a whole when we're actually these different faculties working sometimes against each other. So you can, as Kenneth Smith says, take all that lifetime of experience you have in looking out into the world and trying to understand it. And if you dislocate the socket of your mind, you can turn your mind completely back around to look at itself. And when you do that, all those skills that you have are now being applied to something that has been insulated from them until now. That the defenses that you've built up in your mind to prevent your worldview from being shaken were never meant to protect you against this act. And this act gives you new leverage. And it's not something you're going to be doing earlier in your life. So it's going to be when you're far enough along that you've really committed yourself to your life pattern, and you feel confident that your life makes sense and that your worldview makes sense. It's only then that you even have the opportunity to do this dislocation and this turning back around and critiquing the mind in a way that it never tried to protect itself against. And as a result, you can see all kinds of things you don't want to see. Right? This is when people have good experiences in therapy. This is what's happening. What's happening is, for the very first time in their life, they're looking at themselves in ways that they were never used to doing, and that as a result, they never built up any defenses against. And because of that, it maximizes the difference between what they thought they would see in themselves and what they actually find there. And when the difference is big enough, there's an opportunity for the true nature of their own character to break through the labyrinth and become known to you. And you go, oh my God, have I always done that? Is that what I've all my life I've been sabotaging this certain circumstance whenever it comes up? How can that be true? And yet with the therapist's help, helping you to say it out loud and then listen to what you said, you go, I really am. I'm really doing that. And because at that moment you didn't have a whole labyrinth of defenses in that direction, suddenly you have access to the truth. This is why children are such great learners, because they have no labyrinth at first. When you're first born, there's like no labyrinth at all. You build it up over time as you get more and more Verstand, for example. And in the course of doing that, it makes it harder for reality. Yeah, beginner's mind, says Dave, right on the money. We crave it in martial arts. We're always trying to get out of the experienced mindset and back to the beginner's mindset to look at what we're doing in a new, fresh way. Because when you do that, it gives reality the opportunity to show you the enormous delta between how our worldview imagines the world and how the world actually is. This is the culmination of the myth of Daedalus, right? He and his nephew build wings because there is no way to escape the labyrinth following the rules of the labyrinth. As long as you move about horizontally within the domain that the labyrinth has extended itself, you can't get out. The very act of moving around increases the size of the labyrinth. The process of thinking grows the mental labyrinth. It's only by flying up into third dimension, which is not the dimension that defenses were ever built against, that they could just fly away and get out of the trap of their mind. So even that part of the story of Daedalus and the labyrinth is designed to tell us something critically important. You need to come at your mind in a way that it is not accustomed to defend itself from if you're going to have a chance to break through all those defenses and experience reality as it actually is. And of course, experiencing reality as it actually is dangerous, as we see from Icarus falling from the sky because he flies too close to the sun. But the point of that is not to tell you, so therefore stay in your labyrinth, right? The point of that is to tell you, you're in a whole new world here, full of opportunities and dangers that you have been blind to until now, and you need to proceed with caution. So there is this transitional mode for developing the third faculty of the mind, which comes if you are lucky enough in your life to have held on to some of your childlike qualities, your beginner's mind, whether deliberately or just through opportunity, then you're more likely than other people have to have had opportunities to see the problems with Verstand. So as long as you stay in Verstand, you think Verstand's fine. It's only when you triangulate on it that the Begriff mind says, I know it all makes sense, but I really don't like it. That's just really not satisfying. And I could go do this other thing that I can still do because I have so much Begriff left in me. And then when you do that, it creates the opportunity to triangulate between the two mindsets. Well, that ability to compare and contrast them with each other and to go back and forth and role play consciously is the beginning of breaking free from the trap of thinking that the two represent the entire spectrum of human possibility, which is a huge trap. It's very hard. So yeah, the third one is Vernunft. Vernunft is what we're trying to develop. We're trying to develop the ability to engage in Begriff without doing so at the expense of Verstand, and to engage in Verstand without doing so at the expense of Begriff. And the problem is that if you do either one in its own terms, it can only be at the expense of the other because they exclude each other. So you have to get out of the flatland plane of the basal metabolism of the mind and move in a third dimension to get perspective on them both from above, where they can't stop you from doing it, where their repellency doesn't help them because they repel each other. They're not repelling you up above them. And from up above them, you can begin to make choices about when you do one and when you do the other and how you combine the information that you're getting from both sources. You stop, because you're above them, you stop having either one of them be your master. And you start instead looking down and going, okay, which one is giving me the better answer for this situation? Now, this isn't the end of Vernunft, and this isn't the sum total of Vernunft. This is the gateway to beginning to engage in Vernunft activities, which I'll talk about in a little bit after I call on Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I'm glad at the very end you mentioned a gateway, because I'm going to tell you a story that really happened to me. Of course, when I was very young, I grew up in China and even went to school, at the front of the school was a picture of Mao and the picture of China and that sort of thing. And that was it. And I was surprised. My grandma, through a scheme of their own, finally took us to Hong Kong to be with my mother, which I grew up, I never knew. They could have introduced me to a stranger. I could have believed that was my mom, okay? But she was working as a housemaid to a couple of American missionaries who turned out to be very nice people. And when we went up to the house and the missionaries opened the door, two white people, whatever, Americans, not only me, but all three of us kids, we were so into a structure of understanding that we all broke out singing an anti-American song, right? It's like, it was just surprising that it was like so ingrained within us. We all simultaneously, it wasn't like my older brother started first and we better follow, simultaneously. And then, of course, what if the missionary had been a little less kind? Or what if my grandma had not been there with us? Would we have somehow slowly accepted that situation? Because they just listened very nicely and then, accepted it us in the house, and my grandma seemed to be like okay with that. So that was okay, at least while she was there. And then eventually we were in a condition where we could begin to change our mind, because we were brainwashed. There's no question about it, right? Because brainwashed because all three of us broke out into this song simultaneously. So I think if you weren't given an opportunity to enter that gateway, that might never have happened. So in some sense, the world and some form of society and some form have to give you a kind of maybe it doesn't have to go so far as a welcome mat, although they did, but something that permits you to pass through. And I think that's important because we are trapped into this maze unless we could either find our way out or somebody show us a way out, or suddenly there was an opening. Now, when the opening comes, then in a sense, you could begin to see the world in a completely different way. I'm going to tell you a second story how art was transformed. You know, when I went to college, and then eventually when I, got to know more about art, I went to my advisor this later on. I said, now the way I see art is so different than the way I saw art when I was, a talented high school art student. Uh, and it's like, it's like 170 degrees apart. And he says, shouldn't that be 180? I said, that's too easy. It's 170. So you can't quite match it up. But that's how it was. And I remember one day when we were drawing outdoors under the tree, I guess, in a nice spring day. And I was looking up we were drawing, the landscape, but looking up the tree because part of that was in my drawing. And suddenly I saw the sky as if the sky was like brushing the leaves aside so it could like come through and show itself to me. And I've always thought of the sky as like, well, it's the background, right? Like you got to draw the stuff and it's like the background just happened by itself. It's like there, whatever. But the fact that it sort of opened up, and I explained it to my teacher, that most interesting thing happened. Like this space, this back there, it just sort of came and wanted to greet me. And he says, you got it. He says, you got it. And from that moment on, I saw the difference between a passive picture in which you just laid down whatever the illustration is, and a dynamic picture. Suddenly, it's as if the piece of paper came alive and wanted to show itself in a way that it became a dynamic thing that moved in that way into a space. It's like it was that first step that allowed me to kind of build up to understand the rest of what painting was about. It wasn't about the foreground, middle ground, background, those are less of importance. I mean, the stuff in the background was struggling to come to the front.
Right.
As we have in society now, it's like, and you have to figure out some way to permit the background to come to the front, or else they will like spread the leaves and try to come to the front.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Each of these mindsets has part of the picture it's willing to take in and part of the picture that it's not, and that it insists is background, it suppresses. And they disagree about which part is the foreground and which part is the background, but they're both doing it. They're both warping reality using inverse versions of the same methodology. And the problem is that the truth is the whole. The truth isn't the part that they selected. The begriff mind is abstracting in a different way than the Verstand mind is abstracting. The abstraction, and I hate to use this term, but just for the purpose of this discussion, the abstraction that begriff does that causes it to warp reality is that it misunderstands the part for the whole. Specifically, it takes in the whole of the immediate concrete circumstances, the parochial environment, and assumes that the whole world is like this and that it should be safe to generalize. Right? If I don't like a song, it's a bad song intrinsically. We confuse our experience with objective reality. Or if in my town, nobody ever spoke Chinese, then nobody speaks Chinese. There's this kind of universalizing from the parochial experience that is a form of abstraction. Even though Hegel never uses that term to describe the begriff experience. And even though everything else about begriff is so concrete and so detailed and rich with the juices of life, the problem is that it's a tiny piece of the world. that's being mistaken for the whole thing. And in the case of Verstand, it's the opposite problem. We start getting these manic, wide, generalizing, sweeping, descriptions of the cosmos that leave out all the juice. It's like, so we start talking about all Chinese people are inscrutable, and all black people are like this, and all Russians are like this, and we can do that because in our Verstand schema it all makes sense and it's all logical and valid. It's just that it's missing all the juice of life and reality. It's been evacuated. This is why he uses the word abstraction specifically for Verstand, is that we've gained these powers, these sweeping powers of comprehension at the cost of coming up with information that isn't worth having, because it's just not true. It's missing everything. It's just reduced down to filaments. And so they're both playing foreground, background. And the problem is that the truth is the whole. We both need to be able to look at the big picture, and we need to be able to do so with all the juices of life intact in it. That's the concrete universal that we're striving for with Vernunft. And the problem is that the two operations hate each other. The brain doesn't want to do them both at once. It wants to do one or the other, because they each have to stand on the other and push it down in order to get itself higher. So let's see, Richard and then Donald. Go ahead, Richard. You're on mute.
Hi, sorry about that. Okay, I thought you were going to call him Donald first. Okay. So I have here, like, I think something that kind of really speaks to, I guess, both, this struggle that we have, and then also kind of just in our nation's history and our anti-myth, both today and that, like, over 100 years ago, we also struggled with it. And this is an interview with a historian, Andrew DeBlanco, and he's speaking with Terry Gross, and he's speaking about like how the 1850 Fugitive or Slavery Fugitive Act was kind of one of the seeds of the Civil War. In that, like, because we sometimes think, we want to kind of think that slavery is a problem of the South, but it's an American problem. Like this federal law basically made it illegal to interfere with those that basically go to the North to reclaim escaped slaves, and sometimes it gives bad incentives to just basically grab someone off the street and say, hey, this is my property. Yeah. And then it also kind of like it outlawed, like so when this dynamic started to happen, like cities wanted to, like, were starting to put in laws to prevent basically bounty hunters from coming into their city and just snatching people like off the street. But basically this 1850 law is basically basically gutted a lot of that. And so here's he's saying here, okay. In cities like Boston and Syracuse and others, you literally had citizens watching a Black person seized on the street, dragged into jail in chains, and once the hearing ran its course, taken off to the pier, put on a boat, sent back to undoubtedly worse conditions than those from which he or she had fled in the first place, because they were going back to a very angry master. Having that happen in your own neighborhood in front of your eyes, and being told that if you try to do anything about it, you're committing a federal crime, was a whole new experience. That's why in this book, I try to show how the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 turns slavery from an abstraction into an actuality in the minds of many people who had preferred not to think about it before. Yes. And I think that connects to some of our experience in our own time.
Yes.
And Terry Gross replies, how so? Well, where to begin? I mean, we don't think very hard about where the products come from that we consume every day.
Right.
New Englanders don't think about where the sugar came from that they put into their tea or pastry, sugar that was harvested by slaves. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said at one point, no one tastes blood in the treats. Blood in the treats. New Englanders didn't think about the fact that they might have personal investments in the State Street Bank or some other bank that was making indispensable loans to plantation owners. They didn't think very hard about the fact that the Industrial Revolution that was starting to pick up steam in Massachusetts, where textile mills were at the center of that activity, those textile mills were weaving slave-grown cotton into cloth. They didn't think about the clothes that they were wearing on their own backs.
Right. Yeah, the power of abstraction, right? And it's why so much of the structure of privilege and marginalization under modernism is built around rendering marginalized people invisible. Because if they're invisible, then we deprive you of the juice of life that would be required for you to understand that it's wrong to treat them that way. And then they can be summed up, because we don't have any juice of life about them, they can just be abstractions. And the abstractions are very easy to manipulate by people who are good at manipulating systems, i.e., people who specialize in Verstand. Right, they're then able to tell us that, oh, the only that Black Lives Matter must be a bunch of, ne'er-do-wells who always riot, because they can control which photographs and videos they show you to make sure those are the only photos and videos you see, and that you're deprived of any other evidence that shows hour upon hour of people peacefully gathering and talking. You're not shown any of that because it would get in the way of what's being shown. This is the damage that abstraction can do. And that's why it's not possible to live an honest or ethical life as an intellectual. If you are an ultra intellectual and you live the life of the mind, you're inhabiting abstractions so much that most of the major ethical questions have the juice drained out of them, and you're dealing with constructs of the mind instead of with the real people. But of course, as Kenneth says, you also can't be an ethical person as a begriff person, because you are way too focused on your own immediate concrete environment. And so if you never met a Chinese person, they're all abstract to you. It's like your experience is way too limited. You're not looking widely. And so now anybody can tell you anything about Chinese people and you'll believe it because you have no experience of them. So they both have the same problem of putting their own mental faculty ahead of everything in the universe as the source of truth and rightness, because of the background foreground thing.
One of the most successful myths that we sold the slaves and others is the afterlife.
Right. That was a big deal in Haiti. There was a huge religious struggle in Haiti about the fact that so many of the slaves were kept from revolting by the promise that it was all going to get better as soon as they died. And it's part of why the slave masters hated voodoo, because voodoo told them that wasn't the case and that they were being lied to. And it's why that the Declaration of Independence that led to the slave revolt happened at a voodoo ceremony. It had to be in a context that didn't say that the slavery was okay and that white people deserve no black people. So these are tricky issues. Donald, go ahead.
I don't have any tricky issues, but
sure.
But the stuff you were talking about earlier reminded me so much of R.A. Lafferty's "The Word for the World is Wallpaper," where a young couple decides to explore the world, and they keep finding the same basic pattern, no matter where they go, replicated with exactly the kind of changes only that one would find in a wallpaper selection volume, slightly different color, slightly whatever. It's sort of this, yes, I know the world. I see it.
Yes.
Yes. Wherever I look, you see yourself, or you see your begriff or Verstand projection,
Yes.
With just minor variations.
Yes.
Here it is in blue. Oh, you want blue? Yellow. You like earth tones. That's the only kind of meaningless, you can see the meaningless variation, but you can't see any substantial variation.
Right.
That's great. Lafferty has a lot of stories. I know Kenneth likes Lafferty, and it's just because he points out these problems in seeing and understanding.
Yeah, Oliver Sacks and R.A. Lafferty are two of the non-philosophical authors who Kenneth Smith recommends regularly. So Oliver Sacks gives you all this insight into the ways the brain does not work at all the way we think it does. As you can see when somebody experiences different kinds of damage, and then they start being unable to make distinctions that we didn't even know was a distinction we were making, and seeing the struggles that they go through in their life when this one mental operation is not functioning that we didn't know was a thing, teaches us an enormous amount about how the mind works. And R.A. Lafferty, like Philip K. Dick, is another one of these authors who really upends our assumptions about reality and the way it works. And he takes a lot of philosophical ideas and makes them concrete and tangible in his stories so that we can wrestle with them and go, huh, well, that's really uncomfortable. Sort of a modern SF Kafka kind. All right, so I still haven't told you about Vernunft. I've spent this whole time creating distance from the existing two schemas and starting to point the way to the gateway. So what are we talking about with Vernunft? Well, you can start by process of elimination. The problem that Begriff and Verstand have in common is by definition the thing that Vernunft doesn't do. So if Vernunft is trying to answer questions of right and wrong or true or false, Vernunft does not do so by asking itself what's true or what's good. That's what the other two do. It's not that he never asks, right? The Vernunft mind does want to know what those faculties produce, but it refuses to let either one of them be in charge and dictate terms, first of all. And second of all, it refuses to let the two of them together dictate terms, right? So the synthesizing function can't just turn into a vote. And it can't just turn into a Kantian synthesis in which you look for some combination or compromise of what the two halves of your mind say and say, well, then that must be the truth. Because that would just be still being trapped. Now you're tethered to both labyrinths instead of, escaping them. That the truth isn't in here. The truth is out there, right? We go back to the very first principle of Kenneth Smithian epistemology, the mind versus reality. This is what Kafka said. What's true is what's out in the world, not what's in our head. The moment that we tried to pick whether to use Begriff or Verstand to tell us what was true, we already lost, because we were starting with the proposition that it's up to our brain to dictate terms to reality. Reality's not impressed by whatever our brain has to dictate to it, right? In the contest between yourself and the world, back the world, says Kafka. That is the fundamental truth of epistemology. So, by definition, the Vernunft mindset resolves / reconciles / synthesizes the differences between Begriff and Verstand, not by studying them and focusing on them and trying to cram them together. It does so by looking at what they have to say and then turning away from them both to look at the world and to find the truth in the world. And whatever that truth is, we submit our feelings and our thoughts to it. The mind serves the whole. The whole does not serve the mind. Now, how we do that is a whole other discussion. But that is, by definition, that has to be one of the critical parts of what it means to have Vernunft, is that you stop letting Begriff or Verstand tell you what's real and what's true. Either separately or in combination. They can't lead. They can follow, they can serve, they can help, but they must not lead either alone or together. If they do, you're not doing Vernunft. And the same is true if you just run around and ask a bunch of people their feelings and their ideas and try to put those together and then call that the truth. You're still letting the human mind try to dictate terms to reality. That is still a systematizing Begriff / Verstand approach to the truth. So it is still not Vernunft. Vernunft is different from that. Sharon, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
This is just an observation, nothing philosophical. One of the things that I've observed about people is that the human beings who are evolved, they have two characteristics. And the first one is curiosity.
Yes.
So I would like you to comment on that, because curiosity leads you to the truth. Curiosity leads you to varied experience. And that's what I think leads to integration, to the integration of a human being. I can't express it in the philosophical terms that you are, but there is no melding or there's no synthesis of the two unless you're curious. And that capacity varies from individual to individual.
Right. Right, which is, as Donald has sort of alluded to in previous weeks, it's one of the Kenneth Smithian concepts that people are not the same, that we are born differently. We don't really know what the types are or why we're born differently. Our upbringings are different, but at whatever the causes, over time, we develop different levels of curiosity. We develop different levels of egotism. We develop different levels of attachment to our feelings and experiences. We develop different levels of attachment to our thoughts and ideas and systems. We just do. You can look around and interact with people and it's just obvious. But we work very hard to suppress that and pretend it's not happening. And the thing that's interesting is that, as you say, curiosity is one of the key indicators here, because even though curiosity is a feeling, it's one of the few feelings that draws us outside of ourselves.
Yes.
Right. And if we follow the path of curiosity, it often doesn't follow the path of the labyrinth. Curiosity has that right-brained, creative, unexpected, unconscious quality that Phil talked about in the art experiment that he had people do, where if you follow curiosity, you often don't know where you're going to end up. And as a result, it's not something you've ever prepared for before or defended yourself against. The labyrinth often doesn't go in that direction. And if you follow curiosity, you can often find yourself looking directly at reality. Even if it's in an uncomprehending way, you at least are no longer looking at all of those sterilized, carefully constructed walls that you were in when you were in the labyrinth. So Sharon, once again, you put your finger on one of the critical things. You'll see Kenneth talk a lot about curiosity and creativity and their relationship to giving you ways to snap the trap of the labyrinth.
Well, the other thing I wanted to say, and this is from my personal experience, not only having curiosity, but an openness and a belief that wherever that curiosity leads you, you can handle it.
Yes.
And that factor multiplies as I got older and older and older, and you developed more experience.
Yes.
Then it was okay, because there was no, even if you failed, it was a learning experience. And if you succeeded, it was still a learning experience.
Yes. Exactly. The idea that failure is not bad. And that learning is not bad. You're not going to be judged and told that you're not worthy. All this stuff we do to kids in the educational system makes them afraid to learn, because learning involves experimenting and going you're not sure where and saying things that you're not sure what they're going to be. And if you do that in the classroom when you're told to multiply 7 times 4, then you're going to get the answer wrong almost always, and then you're going to get a bad grade. So there's this process by which the good instructors have to teach the openness and teach the curiosity more than they teach the system and the right or wrong answers. And as long as they do that, kids have a chance of coming through the educational system with some of their begriff intact. But if the more the system turns into testing and grading and tracking people for up or down, the more people come out of it traumatized and unwilling to look at the world because of the risk is too high. What if they got it wrong? And then they become afraid and they turn back to the labyrinth where they feel safe. So yeah, there's all these factors involved in whether people can do that. I think Phil, then Joseph, then Ayala.
Yeah, I want to compliment Sharon for saying that, because I'm going to bring up something to underscore that. I recently heard a tape by Jack Ma. Those of you who don't know Jack Ma is, he's one of the richest guys in China. Now, I do have like a slight prejudice toward Chinese because they're so much into the system. But when I listened to him, he was very inspirational, because like he said, failure is a blessing, which sounds odd, right? He said he failed so much you couldn't believe it. He says he failed to get into the best middle schools because in China it was hard. And so he went to just a very ordinary middle school. He failed to get into the best high schools. And so he went to just a regular high school. he failed to get to the best university. He went to a mediocre university. Okay. And when he got out, he had failed so many times. And then he tried to find jobs over and over again. Like he got rejected like many, many times. And then he even told the story when America came to China, and not the earliest part, but when the business came to China, I think it was Kentucky Fried Chickens. He applied for a job in Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? And now maybe in China at that time, getting a job at Kentucky Fried Chicken is pretty prestigious. I don't know. I don't think it's that prestigious. But I think 36 people apply. He was one of them. 35 got accepted. He was the only one that was rejected.
Everybody but him.
One. Like it's as
now
if
that's a failure.
I know, really.
Well, it's like everyone but you.
That's right. Yeah, except you go away. So you wonder, like, how in the heck did this guy? Because he finally discovered the internet. It was a very early stage at that time. And he said, well, this is an interesting thing. Perhaps something could happen. And then he got a bunch of his friends. They were all very poor. They worked with him. They all contributed some money. They raised a total of $15,000. And of course, at first, in China, there wasn't much interest. I mean, not many people paid. There was like people were poor. But he did, what encouraged him was a lot of people who were poor wrote back and said, we can't give you very much money, but what you're doing with this thing that show what's the world and this and that, all it is so helpful. We're so very grateful to you and so forth, that he got encouraged and he began to say, oh yeah, I'm doing something not only for myself, but for a community of people, right? It's like, wow, okay, like this guy, maybe it's not like ordinary Chinese people that follow a party system, or maybe he's talking to American audience. He's got to say these things, who knows? But nonetheless, it's like, it was so interesting. Is that particularly when you're young, in your 20s, fail, because every time you fail, you learn something. Every time you fail, you learn something, right? And he said, that's a good time to fail. He said, when you get the 30s, you're supposed to have some competence. And when you get to your 40s, you're a little bit more focused now. And when you're 50s, you should have enough knowledge to help a lot of people. He says, at that time, pay attention to the young people, help the young people because they're smarter than you, right? And you got to help them, right? With whatever knowledge you have. And he says, and then when you're 60, you could retire, do whatever it is, 60, 65, whatever. So it's kind of interesting how I think if you were a Chinese, it's kind of frowned upon if you're a failure. But he was not discouraged. Like Kentucky Fried Chicken says, go away.
And he's like, okay, then I will go away.
Well, he said, thanks for the help.
Yeah, thank you, Phil.
Say something very quickly. I think throughout life, you fail, because failure is a part of the life process. But as you get older, those failures have more wisdom attached to them. Mm-hmm. You fail in different ways and you're able to recover. But if you're alive and breathing, you're always going to fail at something. Yeah. That's just part of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharon. Joseph, then Ayala.
Yeah, I think the distinction is like between an open and closed mindset, and the meaning in that is pretty significant on a number of levels. If you have an open mindset that you're continually trying new things, that inevitably you are going to fail, and it's going to be something. It's going to be part of your growth, and that's an important part of your process. Now, having a fixed mindset is where you're staying in the very safe lane, doing only what you know that you can do and limiting yourself to that. Now, the problem with that, think about that in terms of experiences that we have with other people. Now you have a fixed mindset. You have an expectation of the way you think the world should be and the realities of the world. And when the world doesn't meet your expectations, then you act out. And so that there's this danger that comes along with a fixed mindset that is far surpassing than just, achievement. It closes you off from other people and other ideas, and in a sense, living, to be quite honest. So the way I look at this is that when you're talking about, if you're really, getting, and I guess this is a question in a way, if you get too stuck in begriff, that's a kind of a fixed mindset of how you're basically, you're not open to new ideas, new people, and even new experiences. And there, that you see that across the country today, and in many ways. And you see how people react to those things, and how dangerous to both mentally and physically that can be to somebody. So it's a very dangerous, the opposite of not being open, or if you want to say not having a growth mindset, however you would like to put it, is and not failing in that process. It's and because failure also breeds something else. It also breeds an appreciation and a humility that is necessary for genuine understanding. I won't go so far as to say empathy, because I know that if, like, some people don't believe in empathy or something like that, but but at least some idea of sympathy. Okay, but the distinction that we're making here is really this kind of brings it all together. And I'm still looking at your graphics that you provided in December. So yes. I still appreciate those. They're on my phone.
Yay.
And they still ring true to me. So when I'm listening to yes, I have them drawn out too. I just don't have the courage to show everyone. That would be a failure. That would be that I don't need to share. So, right. Especially in front of an artist.
Thank you, Joseph. Ayala, go ahead.
So just before I was going to go to the topic of differences, but before that, you remind me, since you're speaking about failure, there was a very famous study by a psychologist a while ago that wanted to measure the differences between people who see themselves as successful or winners and those who see themselves as losers.
Right.
So they match them on socioeconomic status, on IQ, and the rest of it, the rest of the demographics. And they ask them to keep a journal that starts as they wake up in the morning and ends when they fall asleep. And that is to write every little detailed experience during the day, such as I woke up and turned the coffee pot on and then looked for the key to get to the car. And they asked them to rate. Another column was rate each one of those tiny experiences, or big experiences could be, with whether this was a success or a failure.
Right.
Turns out, and then there was a rubric that asked them to interpret what does this experience say about yourself. So it turned out that like 40%, I think Sharon mentioned it, or somebody, 40% of our daily experiences are little failures that we don't kind of recognize, such as leaving the key behind, forgetting the glasses, and forgetting the mask now in the car, right?
Yes.
Or
yes.
Yeah. And so so there were two groups. No, I mean, the results were analyzed now to look at those that wrote next to it something self-demeaning, or I can't do anything right, or when am I going to pay attention, what's wrong with me, blah, blah. The others turned that experience into a learning of a new strategy of management.
Right.
So if I lost the key this time, maybe I should put it right there on that little hook on by the door.
Yes.
Or, you know, there are a lot of, it started a creative process. Now, they found that even though all of us have about more or less 40% of failure every day, those people who interpret it as this shows that I can't do anything right, call themselves, label themselves, saw themselves as losers. And of course, the others saw themselves as winners. And that's how we see reality, or ourselves in reality, is the way we interpret each small experience. So that kind of stuck in my mind. But what I was going to say too about what you discussed, the differences, the importance of recognizing differences, Rick. The basis of tolerance, the whole idea of tolerance is seeing differences, is noticing, right? But at the same time, we recognize also very deep commonalities. And to me, the commonality is not just with humans, but with all life. Mm-hmm. The awesome thing that's called life. And what it enhances is the tolerance, the respect, the love, all that. So it's not just, the differences are more styles, cultures, beliefs, but the commonalities are much deeper than that.
Yes. Thank you, Ayala. Well, Sharon, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
And this is just my experience. The exciting part of being alive, I think, is learning. And this dovetails with what Ayala says, learning more about the world, because there's such commonality to our humanity. That's the essence of it. So when I listen to Phil saying, well, you know, he didn't go to Morehouse because he wasn't sure about their culture, that's worrisome to me. Because that's a chance for him to expand, right? And in fact, my son went to Morehouse, and the first year he came home, he says, you know, Mom, there's one white guy in the class and he has a full minority scholarship.
Nice.
So that young kid enlarged his life just by being brave.
Right.
Right.
But Phil would have had to pay.
No, wait a minute. I have to defend myself. Yes, in part, I was worried about me not fitting in. Okay, that's true. But the more important part is that I would be going in there with at least a degree of authority. And I was worried about me passing that sense that is perhaps dissonant from what the people need. So that was more of my concern.
You didn't want to be a colonizer.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to be a colonizer. You know, if it was just me as a student, I probably would have done it, because like it's about me growing, right? So you have to consider your action also affect other people as well, particularly if you're in a position of authority, right? So
yes, but the essence of you is being able to modify that authority to fit the situation.
Yeah, okay.
See, this is all full of good stuff. I'm going to call on Richard, and then I'm going to wrap us up for this week. Go ahead, Richard.
I think Dave might file that away. Oh, did Dave leave? Okay. I think Dave left.
Yeah, he had to go.
Okay.
But say it anyway.
I know. I just remember the shoe was on the other foot when Sharon was telling us about a bad date. Where her date was voted for Trump, and Dave was
Right.
trying to convince about being open to. Anyway, that's not my
I see
point
what you did
actually.
there.
My kind of point was actually kind of in response to Ayala's kind of like, I guess, the study about like being winners or losers, and there's something I'm seeing a common thread kind of in different things that I'm studying. Are things like a few years ago from studying Buddhism. So Buddhism, like at least this particular school, which I don't remember the name of the school, but I can probably look it up. But they kind of have like these sources of suffering. I think 7 different sources of suffering,
Yes.
and then they call it hot. Like for pride, they have hot pride and cold pride.
Yes.
Whereas hot pride is I'm so good, and that's what we understand commonly. And then cold pride is sort of the negation of that, which is I'm so bad.
Right.
But in both cases, it's a source of suffering as well as an obstacle.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting in that, like, so studying René Girard, his first book concludes in that the renunciation of pride is really important, and in really kind of like relating to the world, like out there, and understanding, that there's this false barrier we put between kind of us and the other that's really not that way at all.
Yes.
And actually, like, I guess like the people who were studying with me, and this was like we've been together for months, like they kind of didn't really quite, I'd been exposed to this idea like previously, so it wasn't that hard, but like just that pride and shame are sort of different sides of the same coin.
Right.
And so I kind of brought this up to kind of like kind of help them see that, as well as like sort of, there was a TED talk, and like he kind of frames it this way as well, is that like our society in the West, and modern society, is so obsessed with self-esteem. Either we have such bad self-esteem, and then how do we get good self-esteem, positive self-esteem? And then it's like, what is the third way is to not worry so much about self-esteem, like to basically be like
humble.
Sorry?
Humble, to be humble.
Or to be kind of like, like how, like, amoral, or like to kind of like just not worry about it, like not be obsessing about it, like the self so much, right? So not even worry about negative or positive, like just not even have it to be so dominating our thoughts, I guess. And so I guess the kind of winner and loser, I guess that's kind of one step in reframing it. But I think if there's sort of like a further step that we can go from there. That's sort of my response.
There is, but we'll have to do it next week. And next week is
what are we doing next week?
So next week we'll pick up here, but we're going to talk about archai. Because archai are what the Aristoi use instead of feelings, experiences, or idea systems to align themselves to. That's the master that an Aristos seeks when he engages in Vernunft. So I'm gonna cut us off here just because we're like 20 minutes over, and I know we always have more to say because we have such a good time talking together.
Rick, I just want one sentence about what Joseph said.
Okay, go ahead.
Joseph, I totally agree. And the opposite, the contradiction to self-esteem is self-acceptance.
Right.
Think about that.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayala.
Excellent point, Ayala.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
So so next week we'll talk about that and how that applies, because that's the source of mythos. It all comes from the Aristos's use of Vernunft to search for archai, and then to try to explain archai in a way that they and Duloi and Banausoi can all understand and remember. So that's the punchline for Mythos and Logos. So let's do it next week.
Self-acceptance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.